Okay, so welcome everyone and thank you for being with us. We at Uruk, we have been conducting Uruk education and orientation webinars for the past months. And today we are pleased to have Mr. Bill Duncan, who will be presenting the topic, the good, the bad, and the ugly, how good practices get reverted. This is as part of the Uruk educational series of webinars. We will learn in this presentation more about why do we see so many projects in trouble and how good practice get turned into bad practices and how it's eventually get pushed to such illogical extremes that it becomes truly ugly. Our speaker, Mr. Bill Duncan, is recognized as one of the world-leading experts on the theory and practice of project management. He's the primary author of the original PMBOK guide and responsible for various roles with GPMA and IPMA in the US. Welcome, Mr. Duncan, and thank you for being with us. I think I remember, like everybody will, if anybody will have a question and answer, we will have them at the end of the presentation. And if anybody have anything during Mr. Duncan's presentation, you can post it in the chat box, and then we can come back to it and look at your questions. And today it's a small meeting, so I believe it's going to be very interactive, and I hope everybody will enjoy it. Thank you, Mr. Bell.
Okay, thank you. Let's get started here. You see the title, I call them practice perversions. Formally stated, this is my third law, say any good idea will eventually be pushed to an illogical extreme. I've noticed in a variety of areas, but today we'll be focusing just on project management. To give you a couple of non-project examples, here's a picture of camping, people having lots of fun outdoors. Weather looks great. And here's, I'm sorry, sometimes my computer doesn't advance. And here's camping pushed to what I consider to be an illogical extreme. People with their tents pitched vertically on the side of a mountain in winter. You might occasionally catch me in the prior campground here, but you will never find me perched on the side of a mountain in winter. Here's another idea. Look at these three terms here. Clearly defined job descriptions, performance-based promotions, and consistent guidance about expectations. Does this sound like good governance? Does this sound like an environment that you would like to work in? My experience is that most people say, yes, absolutely, sounds wonderful. But this is, in fact, the original description of what we now consider to be bureaucracy. Right? So the original ideas, which were very positive and seemed very good, have become negative over the years. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we get from a good idea to an ugly one. First, in project management, I think one of the biggest issues is we tend to assume that all projects are alike, or that all projects are like our projects. So if you look at the graphic elements here, the difference between building Burj Khalifa and building a small cottage home, maybe at the 30,000 foot level, there are a lot of similarities, but when you get into the detail level, the differences are massive. The overhead, the need for controls, the need for experimentation. There's some cool things, for example, about Burj Khalifa that most people don't know. They actually invented a technique for pumping concrete up to the higher floors so that they didn't have to hoist it in buckets. It's a patented technology. It's been used in other projects, but you probably don't have to invent too much if you're building a small one-family home. Pharmaceutical research projects, that's supposed to be an image of the COVID-19 virus. Or if we look in the lower right-hand corner, if we look at computer-oriented projects, particularly software projects, at 30,000 feet, very similar. Many of the processes are the same, but the details are generally quite different when you're down on the ground. So we have to be aware of both the similarities and the differences. Another thing I call this reading the pictures and skipping the text. This is a graphic from the 1996 PMBOK guide. And I got a comment from somebody after the, actually a couple of you may even know him. I won't name him. I got a comment from somebody after the book had been published that said, this isn't the only way or even the best way to develop software. And I said, well, yeah, no argument. Well, why would you think we were advocating this as the best way to develop software? And he said, well, that's the picture you got in the book. And I said, well, did you read the text around it that says this is just an example and there are many different ways? And he kind of went, no, I didn't actually look at the text. Basically, he said, I just looked at the pictures. And this happens far more often than I like to admit. The other item has nothing to do with Disney being in the news these days. The idea that if some is good, then more must be better. So if we have one good idea, we will apply it to big areas, or we will apply it again and again and again. And it will obviously be better if it worked in the small. So now, why, being in project management, should you care? All right. The main reason, I think, is that poor practice results in poor outcomes. As you see the list here for you, for your employer, your company, for society at large, and I've been doing a lot of work with sustainability lately, for our planet as well. We're wasting resources. We're not doing the right thing. And poor practice also affects how we are seen by others. Now, this is a chart that I've been using for a number of years. You'll see government recognition across the top. You'll see public recognition down the side. I've listed some professions, shall we call them, in each of the boxes. And I think everybody wants to be in the upper right-hand corner. You've got physicians, you've got lawyers, architects, accountants, all of those government recognition. You need to be licensed by the government. You need to be approved by the government to practice as a physician or lawyer. And generally speaking, the public recognizes these disciplines as being professions. Now, lower right-hand corner, we have nurses, barbers, plumbers, hairdressers, a variety of disciplines that are recognized by the government. You have to pass a test, you have to pay a fee in order to practice in one of those fields. But for the most part, public does not think of these as well-respected professions. Upper left-hand corner, management, general management, executives, scientists, also public recognition, probably pretty high, but you don't need a license from the government to work as a scientist, to work as an executive. Now, the last quadrant here, we've got project managers and cost engineers. We don't have government recognition for the most part. We don't have public recognition either for the most part, unless you want to consider the fact that Dilbert frequently pokes fun at project managers as being a form of public recognition. Now, APM in the UK does have a chartered project manager certification. Chartered in the UK means that it's recognized by the government. So at least in that one country, they've moved project managers into the upper right-hand corner. But that's still very limited, since the role of project manager goes from very small project to very complex project. You aren't going to be able to get the APM to certify you as a registered project manager if you are managing birthday parties for 10-year-olds. There isn't the complexity, there isn't the challenge, et cetera, and so forth. So we have this issue with how project managers are seen by others. If we deliver our projects effectively and consistently, and I'll go back to APM in the UK, their vision is a world in which all projects are successful. And we've adopted that for IPMA USA in the US as well. And I think it's just absolutely brilliant. That's what we should be striving for. And if we have a situation where all projects are successful, then it wouldn't be too hard to actually move ourselves as project managers into that upper right-hand corner. Now, I've listed a couple of my favorite project management uglies here. We don't have time to go through all of them in detail. So I'm basically going to take them in alphabetical order, and we should get through the first 5, which is from Agile through the corrective action. Let's start with Agile. Here is a screen grab from the manifesto for Agile software development. And there's some really good stuff here. As somebody who spent a good part of his early career developing software, I think there are some very cool things in the manifesto. But if you pay attention, it's about software. It's in the title. It's not the manifesto for project management. It's not the manifesto for new product development. It's the manifesto for Agile software development. And if you look at the preface there, we're uncovering better ways of developing software. Once again, software. And if you look at the 4 principles, the second one says working software, one of the things we value. If you continue to the principles, these are just the ones that I could fit on one screen, but you'll basically see here that most of the principles are also oriented towards software development. This is all good. If you're developing software, there's some stuff in the Agile manifesto that I think is absolutely brilliant. It works really well for software, doing it small pieces, incremental. Monir will tell you that some of the work in the URC platform is being done incrementally, basically following most of the principles and practices of the Agile manifesto. The manifesto starts to get a little bit ugly, though. It starts to go from good to bad when the advocates demonize waterfall. First of all, I've asked people where they get their description of waterfall, and most people can't tell me. They can't point to a description. They've just been told or they've heard that waterfall is bad. Or the ones who can point to a description of waterfall will go back to Royce's paper, where he describes waterfall as a bad way to develop software. And if I ask people to describe an environment they've been in or that they've seen or heard of, where anybody was actually developing waterfall, it was developing software following waterfall as it was described in Royce's paper, it's nowhere to be seen. Right? And the second thing that I think started to bring Agile from good to bad is when people got excited, they became fanatical. I call them agilistas, and they would assert that Agile is appropriate for all phases of all projects. I've included a link here to an article that I wrote that's on LinkedIn, based upon a comment from somebody who is a big fan of Agile and was describing how Agile would work well in the construction of a single family home. And he just had so many things wrong. It was clear he knew absolutely nothing about the construction process, absolutely nothing about how an architect would work with a construction contractor or work with the owner of the home. He just had it all wrong. And that happens again and again and again. People are such fanatical believers of the value of Agile that they think it can be applied anywhere without having any experience or any knowledge of other fields. I think it started to get truly bad when people started equating Agile with agility. Agility, being flexible, accommodating changes, that's been part of project management forever. Even if you go back to the 1996 PMBOK guide, right, 25 years ago, and most of the writing for that was really done 3 or 4 years before it was published, so nearly 30 years ago. And that was based upon experience going back 10, 15 years. So we're looking at the practices in the 96 PMBOK guide as really being 40, 50 years old. But there are all sorts of things in there describing differences, can be flexibly defined, can be rigidly applied. This describes how processes typically interact, but they may interact differently in your environment with your type of project. So there's all sorts of stuff about being flexible. There's even a section on customizing the process in the PMBOK guide that talks about that. So you don't have to apply Agile in order to demonstrate agility. One of the other things that drives me crazy also is calling Agile a mindset. Mindset means you can't really describe or define. You can't really tell whether you're doing it right. It's sort of like pornography. I'll know it when I see it. Well, Agile is the same. I'll know it when I see it. But if you tell me where is that mindset defined, what does it really mean to have an Agile mindset? It can be something of a battle. If we were to go back to the things I clipped from the website of the manifesto, they talk about Agile processes, but Agile processes really aren't well defined or well described. In fact, I'd be willing to bet that 90% of the advocates for Agile don't realize that there's a difference between Agile and Scrum. They think that Scrum is Agile and there's no other way. They're not aware of things like extreme programming and so on that are part of the Agile movement. Then not too long ago, I heard somebody tell me that just-in-time was Agile, even though just-in-time goes back to the early 1960s. It's part of the Toyota production system. Toyota invented it or came up with a concept. And it's got probably just as many disadvantages as it has advantages depending upon the environment that you're in. And then, of course, last but not least, people start to talk about Agile project management. But none of the Agile principles or guidance really addresses the full scope of project management. Let's look at the second one, the body of knowledge. Here's a quote from the original PMBOK guide from the 1996 version. And I haven't changed the thing. It's a direct copy. All right. And what you'll see here is that PMBOK is not the book. PMBOK's a concept. All right. People doing something stupid is still part of the PMBOK. And PMBOK rests with the practitioners. It's not in a book. I used to joke about how could the entire body of knowledge be contained in this, one thin book, because that's about how thick it was at the time. And there's a piece of me that thinks that PMI has made it get bigger and bigger in order to counter that argument. But if you think about it, the project management body of knowledge really is pretty massive. And it covers anything and everything. That's part of the body of knowledge, not just what's in the book. Right? And yet people continue to call it PMBOK instead of referring to it as the PMBOK guide. And even as the guide, it doesn't cover the full body of knowledge. And it really talks about how to manage a single project. Right? Doesn't get into portfolio management, selecting projects. It doesn't get into program management. It doesn't really talk about ensuring that benefits are realized and how to make sure that projects are aligned with strategy and all those other kinds of things. It's really focused on how do you manage a single project. So it should probably be retitled A Guide to Managing a Single Project. Now, how does it get bad? Well, I think largely due to PMI's financial success, everybody kind of jumped on the bandwagon. Now, APM had a BOK at about the same time. IPMA has their individual competence baseline, or ICB. ISO 21500, the original version is now 21502, I guess, was basically based on the PMBOK guide with a couple of minor changes and a little bit of language differences. And then PM2 is the current European standard project management methodology. And everybody's yelling, this is the right way, this is the best way, this is what you want to do for your projects. As opposed to taking what I think is the appropriate approach, which is to look at all of these pieces as pages in an atlas, okay? And if you think of a world atlas, the map is not the thing, but you don't really understand everything without looking at all of the pieces. Now, the individual competence baseline, for example, is really more oriented towards people who are managing projects, all right? And it's about the competencies that you need to manage a project effectively. It doesn't talk about how to develop a WBS. It doesn't even tell you they have to develop a WBS. But it does tell you that you need to understand how to define the work of the project. Right? which I don't think anybody would argue with. But as people started becoming, or as organizations in particular started becoming more competitive, everybody was arguing about which one is the right one, which one is the best one. And I think it got truly ugly when people started saying that theirs was the best and the only way. Okay. So people say this is the right way to manage projects. If you want to be effective, if you want to be professional, you must follow the PMBOK guide. You must follow ICB. You must follow PM2. Garbage. Okay. What you need to do is look at the needs of your project, the skills and ability of your team, and choose an appropriate approach. And you look at all of the literature. You want to look at the full body of knowledge and decide what is appropriate, what is going to be most useful for you on your projects. Now let's go to Brooks's law, from good to ugly. Brooks says, and this is a quote from the original Mythical Man Month. I believe I may still have it on my shelf. That's the original edition. There is an updated edition. Brooks says adding resources to a late project makes it later. And that's quoted far and wide. I probably guess that every project manager in software is familiar with that. And project managers in many other disciplines are as well. But it started to get bad when it got changed to simply adding resources to a project will make it late. But that's not true. If you discover that you're behind schedule, that your scope has changed, you haven't understood scope, whatever the reasons, if you realize you've got a problem and you add enough reasons soon enough, enough resources soon enough, you may in fact be able to deliver the project on time. That of course assumes that timely performance is more important than cost-effective performance, because maybe what you want to do is just go ahead and deliver late, but deliver within your budget. And I think what made it really crazy is when people started thinking that if they didn't add resources, they would somehow be able to bring the project in on time. That by working people extra hours, nights, weekends, abusing the team, that somehow the project would magically come in on time. Just not true. Let's move on to the next one, certification. Now I need to be a little bit careful here because I am heavily involved in certification, both for IPMA USA and GPM. I think we try and keep things to the good. And the good is when you've got a certification, it's a certificate of achievement. You have met some set of standards, and that's what your certificate says, right? And that's great, right? The PMP, for example, was originally intended to allow the project manager to know that their team members had a basic understanding of project management so that he didn't have to explain concepts to them, that they understood the basic concepts. Now, certification becomes bad, I think, when you assume that all certifications are the same. This is a graphic that Stacy Goff, whom I think many of you probably know, developed for an article he wrote for IPMA called Comparing Certifications. And he maintains, and I agree with him 100%, that the certifications differ. They can be broad, they can be rigorous, they can have strong prerequisites, or they can be weak on any of these. They can be very narrow in scope, they can have very few prerequisites, and so on. And I think certification started to get bad when people ignored these differences and basically treated all certifications as if they were the same. In particular, what happens is a lot of HR departments screen resumes using the certifications, and they miss experienced people because the people got their experience. They've been proving their skills and their ability in the marketplace for years. And it's like, why should I spend 500, 1,000, 2,000, whatever the number might be on certification? So I think certification's okay if you understand that it is recognizing achievement and you understand what it is you've actually achieved, what's actually being recognized. I think certification gets really ugly when people start assuming that passing a multiple choice test is equivalent to competence. Right? I think at this point, everybody who's on this call understands that that's not true, but there are an awful lot of people who will pass a test and think that they are now competent as a project manager. Even IPMA certifications, which do in fact assess competence, right? Some of them use multiple choice, some of them use, some of the levels use essay questions, we all use interviews, but that's not a guarantee of competence in the future. What it's saying is if you understand that certification, that you have demonstrated your competence in the past. It's still up to the hiring manager or whoever is involved to determine whether your current skills are such that you would be likely to manage one of their projects successfully in the future. It also doesn't say, for example, necessarily that someone who has been certified at level B with a software background would necessarily be effective managing a level B complexity project in construction. So there's still other things you have to do as part of the hiring process. But too many organizations are using the certification as a filter, using it to avoid doing due diligence. And I think that's part of the reason why many projects fail, is they're being managed by people who passed the certification, but couldn't manage their way out of, the expression goes, a wet paper bag. Corrective action. And this is the last one that I've got slides for, but we can talk about some of the others more if you want. But basically, if you look at a project that's taking you from an origin to some future state, and you develop budget schedule, you define the scope, analyze risk, et cetera, and so forth. So we've got a plan that covers all of these things. And at some point, we want to look at how our actual is gone. And we want to say, here's where we are today. And corrective action, in its broadest sense, offers two choices. Either how do we get back to the original plan in some way, or developing a new plan that will still get us to our desired future state, but perhaps in a more efficient and effective way. What people often don't understand is that corrective action should also consider looking at a new future state. Things may have changed. Perhaps the original target of your project is no longer appropriate. And either of the first two lines that I showed there, getting back to the original plan, makes no sense at all. We want to go someplace different. So to me, that's a good understanding of corrective action, what it should be. Corrective action starts to get bad when we limit the plan to budget and schedule. And we really look at corrective action as being, how do we get from where we are today to back on plan at some point in the future? And it gets really bad when it gets twisted to, oops, we need to push ourselves back to the original plan, even if that's not an efficient way of getting to our desired future state. All right, so taking the cure. How do we avoid this? Well, first of all, we have to understand that context is king. Mark has heard me say this probably 1,000 times, but we have to understand the person that we're listening to when we're being told something, right? Do they do projects similar to ours? Are they actually project managers, or are they consultants? Are they newcomers? Have they managed large projects or only small projects? I'm going to give more credence to something that is told to me by the guy who is the manager of Burj Khalifa than to the guy who managed a single family home that I bought. And it's not that one of them is less competent than the other. They're competent in different areas. They have different sets of skills to deal with different sets of problems. So we need to make sure we understand the context. There are lots of posts on LinkedIn, for example, where it's clear from what the person is writing that their experience is in software and software only. They have no experience with heavy construction or even light construction for that matter. And the reverse is true as well. I've seen some posts from people whose background is in heavy construction, and they simply don't understand the software development environment. So we need to understand context when we're processing information. Second thing we need to do is be skeptical. I like this little cartoon. Guy says, I design and build skepticism detectors, and the one in his pocket starts going off because the guy is clearly skeptical. I think skepticism is a virtue. All right, ask questions. When somebody tells you something, don't take it at face value. All right, there's a huge amount of bad information that circulates. Comparisons of management versus leadership on LinkedIn, for example. I had another illustration in mind and I just lost it, but we need to look at something that we're being told and be skeptical about it. The next potential item that I had on my list was failure rates. There's a 70% number that keeps getting quoted, and that 70% number has absolutely no basis in fact. All right. It was made up by a headline writer who was told by an author that his experience was that most projects fail. And the comment, most projects fail, without any documentation to back it up, without any statistics, numbers, or data, got turned by the headline writer into 70% of projects fail. And that 70% has been copied and repeated on and on and on. And if you're skeptical about that stuff and you do some research and find out what's really going on, you'll find out that 5% of projects fail. So be skeptical. Don't be cynical. Don't assume that everybody is lying, that everybody is wrong. But if somebody tells you something that doesn't feel right or doesn't sound right, it probably isn't right. And ask a couple of questions. And finally, last item is ask for evidence. All right. If somebody tells you something that doesn't sound right, say, where's the research to back that up? How do you know that's true? All right. Is it based upon your experience? And if so, is it based upon 10 years of experience, 20 years of experience, or 2 months of experience? And with what kinds of projects? Again, ask people to tell you what's going on and to back up the statements that they're making, to back up their assertions. All right. And if the evidence is there and it seems plausible, then you found something that you can adopt, and it's probably good practice. That's what I planned for today. We got questions. There's a bunch of stuff in the chat memo here. Andy commented, especially the open book cert exams. Yep. Mark Moore commented about when certifications don't expire. Do we have any questions there? Oh, Andy, I'll take that as a question. Comment on positive risk.
It's an opportunity. Why they felt they had to homogenize that under risk.
Let me tell you, I am at least partially responsible for that. When we were working on the 1996 PMBOK guide, there were lots of discussions about the titles of the chapters. We inherited the titles from the previous document, which were really based upon the departments in a construction company, with a couple of exceptions. And when we were looking at the various titles of the chapters, it was communication and information management, risk and opportunity management, contract and procurement management. And I'd have to think of it for what the other ones were, but we had potential 2-word titles for, I think, all of the chapters except maybe integration. And we talked about it for a bit, and finally decided that we didn't want 2-word titles because that would really make the text in the And the process description is really difficult because instead of just saying risk identification, it would become risk and opportunity identification. And it would really make things a little complex. So we decided that we'd stick with the old titles, but that what we would do is we would mention opportunity management as part of what's in risk, and that risk could be thought of as being divided into threats and opportunities. That doesn't really fit with the definitions in English language dictionaries. It's widespread throughout the project management community now, but it's not supported by any English language dictionary that I've ever found. Risk is always about bad things that can happen to you in the future. Splitting it into threats and opportunities isn't that bad. I mean, I can deal with that. I can accept that. The basic process, we want to identify threats, we want to identify opportunities. We want to analyze threats, we want to analyze opportunities. That works for me. But converting that into positive risks just gets you so tangled up in your underwear. For example, if risks can be threats or opportunities, then positive risks can be positive threats or positive opportunities. And then you also have to have negative opportunities, which can be negative threats or negative opportunities. And the language just gets so confused that it's crazy. So if you want to split risks into threats and opportunities, fine. But talking about positive risks, as far as I'm concerned, just flat out dumb.
Well, and Bill, that would feed right back into the old whiteboard quadrant tool of doing a SWOT analysis of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and then you go and grade from there as to what really is worth pursuing or worth defending against. So I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's been in place for a long, long, long time.
Yeah, and you've also got people who argue that risk and uncertainty are the same. People who argue that risk and uncertainty are different. So one of the issues there is something I really didn't cover today, but I think that's something we've all talked about on many occasions. That's the need for, if you can't get a single definition, at least within your group, get agreement on what the definition is so that you're all speaking the same language.
Bill, I don't know if you recall, I don't know, years ago, I think there was some discussion with the PMI, maybe after you left, to change the risk management to call it uncertainty management. Anybody, Andy, Mark, or Bill, have you heard anything about that?
That would have been after my time.
Yeah, I don't recall that. It's been going on 15 years since I've had any chapter affiliation or anything. Andy, I think you're more current than the rest of us. Have you heard any of that?
I think you'd probably get even more extreme reactions in mind to positive risks. You obviously cannot manage uncertainty. You can only manage your response to it. And I think trying to get people to agree that uncertainty and risk are the same would be a huge battle.
Well, but that's one of the problem. I think either in the 3rd or 4th edition or 5th edition of the PMBOK guide, they changed the word manage risk to control. They used to have manage risk and control risk, and then they changed it to monitor risk. Yeah, because of that kind of an argument that we cannot control, we cannot manage or control risk. Yeah, we cannot manage or control risk. Same thing like we cannot manage stakeholder, right? But we can manage the relationship, or we can manage the impact or minimize the impact. So sometimes we take those words too literal, like control. So what is the word control? Control, that doesn't mean, we want to like a dictatorship or like even control the team. I think PMI have even removed that term from the PMBOK a couple of editions ago, because the idea is that, in political correctness, you cannot control a team. Well, technically, the idea of control, if it is about checking the plan and if there's any deviation, take corrective action, right? Then control is not about, dictatorship or those kind of things. So sometimes we take some of these terms too literal, I guess. And I guess that's aligned with the idea of when we make these terms become ugly, the way we use them.
Yeah. Munir, I think what usually happens there is that people pick one definition from the dictionary and they decide that that is the definition.
Yeah.
And I think if you go back and you look at Max Weideman's advocacy for project lifespan rather than project life cycle, he quotes one definition of cycle to say it doesn't apply to projects, but there are 3 or 4 definitions of cycle in most dictionaries, and the other definitions of cycle all do obviously apply to projects and project management. But I think you're seeing the same thing with definitions of risk or uncertainty, with control. There's a group out there who doesn't like to have people called resources. You can call me a resource till the cows come home, and it's not going to bother me in the least, but it does bother some people.
Well, oddly enough, on that one, Bill, all the major platforms out there now refer to it as HCM, human capital management. So go figure. I think I'd rather be a resource than capital.
And capital, yeah, I'm not sure how that really humanizes it all that much more.
I think that, sorry, go ahead, Andy.
I just appreciate your approach on this. I was thinking of adaptation of the George Box quote about all models are wrong, some are useful, as you went through this, because it's not like any of these things are necessarily bad or good. It's where are they? And so you didn't get to the triangle, but what I think is interesting, and I've read enough of what you said about that. I think I know your position on it, but interestingly, I run into so many people after classes, and even when I teach it, I'm like, this oversimplifies it. It doesn't work in every situation, but it's something that they remember. So I'd be interested in your. I think I understand your ugly part of it, but good, yeah, like good, bad, ugly on the iron triangle. Would you be willing to comment on that?
Well, I think the good on the iron, the ugly is the iron triangle. Right. The good is the triple constraint. And when I teach it, do you want to see that slide?
I love it. Yeah.
Okay. Is that okay with you, Munir?
Yeah, go ahead.
This will take just a minute for me to track.
Yeah,
it
while
here.
he's pulling that up, Andy, I'm right with you. As a matter of fact, years ago, I started calling it SQRT, because scope, quality, resources, and time, because they have this amorphous relationship to each other. And then always I struck a sanity check line through the middle of that, because otherwise you're just quoting text.
Right.
And yeah, I've had the same thing happen to me.
Yeah.
Just a second here. I talk about the triple constraint plus one, and people normally draw it in this way. And I'll say, what does this image remind you of? Anybody?
Yield or pyramid.
If it were orange, it'd be a slow-moving vehicle in the Midwest.
I usually think of it as a pyramid, right? And a pyramid is a large, stable structure. So when I teach triple constraint, I invert it so that the point is going down, because what I want to emphasize is balance. Right. If you go back to the early days, and I forget the guy's name, in the UK, called it the iron triangle. He was really dealing with a situation of a project under contract, and he was dealing just with the contract. I wasn't dealing with the larger world of the project, where scope may be getting changed and dealing with change orders and stuff. So first of all, I draw it with the point down to emphasize balance. Then I label the sides as constraints, not just scope, because it's not scope, it's scope constraints. And I include quality and performance as alternative terms, because in project management, I really think quality is a subset of scope or an aspect of scope. and then schedule and time constraints, and then cost constraints, which may be funding, staffing, resources, however you want to call it. But I intentionally labeled the sides rather than the points, because if you understand the reason for using the triangle as an image, and if you recall your high school geometry, a triangle is a stable structure. You cannot change one side without affecting another side. All right. So if you want to expand the scope constraints, which in this case would really be relaxing them, you either need more time or more money. And then the last thing that I add is the +1. Is stakeholder interests are constrained by that map. So if you fail to establish a balance, somebody's going to suffer. In software, we usually penalize the developers. We ask them to work nights, weekends, whatever the case may be, and they suffer. Or we compromise on scope. We cut out features and functions in order to meet a date, and the customer doesn't get what they wanted. And I think this was my initial understanding, if you will, of the triple constraint. And the only thing I've really changed to my initial, or how it was originally described to me, was to turn it upside down so that it emphasizes the concept of balance. But to me, the iron triangle is what's ugly.
This is
you
good
get,
stuff, Bill.
Iron triangle, you know, they're usually putting scope schedule on the points instead of on the side. They're not using the term constraint. It's called triple constraint for a reason, guys. And if you don't have the word constraint in the diagram, you can't call it triple constraints. So anyway,
That's good. Thanks.
that's my story and I'm sticking to it.
No, that's good. And it dawns on me when you talk about it in software development, you usually short shift the development team, and yet you expect that the quality and performance, the scope remains the same, and yet you shot torpedoes straight at one of the key elements in building something of stated quality.
Possibly. And one of the things that I've said is if you don't maintain balance, then the stakeholder interest just kind of dribbles out of the hole in the triangle, wherever you've created it.
Yeah. This is good.
Yeah, my perspective on this years ago when I was working on a mega project, actually we were looking at 4 constraints, because when you're dealing with construction, you will have to worry about safety, health, and environment as well. And the way our director used to tell us is basically, when we look at this, okay, the idea is that we must balance all of these. So when you are developing your project plan and cost estimate and schedule and scope, they have to be balanced. However, once shit hit the fence, or I'm not sure of the saying that things start to go bad on a project, right? Is that which one would you sacrifice first? So if something has to go, which one? And we used to basically, our project director used to always argue with our executive on this, that, you need to give us one. Said, no, all equal. They cannot be all equal, because sooner or later, we're gonna basically hit some problem, and we're gonna have to face and try to decide which one is the most fixed or the most constraint in order to allow variables. So if the scope and the quality, or is it cost, or is it time? And our executive would basically kept refusing to give us an answer, and said, you have to live with all 4 constraints.
I think that's where the concept of the iron triangle comes, when management won't accept that something has to be compromised.
Yeah.
And the way I've always presented it is, okay, if you're not willing to adjust any of the constraints here, then that means somebody's going to suffer. Somebody in the middle, the team, the stakeholders, the customer, somebody somewhere down the line is going to suffer. And the way I present it is, I have no problems with making someone suffer. but let's make it clear that this is a conscious decision that we're taking to make the team suffer, to make the stockholders suffer, to make the customer suffer, or whatever, but recognize that your decision has an impact, and that impact is on the stakeholders.
Yeah, and that goes back to your discussion about corrective action. If we are going to try to force everything to go back to normal, it doesn't work that way, right? This is why I never like the word recovery plan, because we can never really recover. So what we have to do is replan, and that replan could include another future state. And that's where the triple constraint concept will apply in those discussions.
And I see a comment here in the chat from Fadi. He says, this is where collaborative advantage helps. Absolutely.
Yeah.
If the people involved with the project recognize that it's a collaboration, that we are all working together, you're more likely to make the decision that maximizes the results for the largest number of stakeholders.
Favorite quote out of Apollo 13 as it goes through is the young engineer John talking to Ken Mattingly, says, Ken, you're telling me what you want, I'm telling you what you have.
Yep. And the other thing I like about the triple constraint is if you're trying to communicate it to somebody, walk up to a flip chart, walk up to a whiteboard or a blackboard, draw the triangle. It's clear. It's a wonderful visual image for communicating what the issues are.
Yeah.
And when somebody says, we can't compromise any of the constraints, well, you've got the stakeholder interest in the middle and say, okay, well, understand the impact on this stakeholder, on this group of stakeholders. That's the choice that we're making. Is that the choice that you want to make or not? And I have not run into very many irrational senior managers. If you present them with good information clearly in a manner that they can understand it, they will make a good decision. They will not act irrationally. Just look, for example, at imposed dates. If you use this for imposed dates, I understand that you feel this has to be done by the end of the year. Understand what that means. We either need to reduce the scope or we need to spend more money. And if we don't do one of those two things, somebody in the middle is going to suffer. And I've had student after student say, I didn't believe it would work, but it did. I've had managers attend my classes, and I'll ask the managers direct to their face, does this communicate to you the decision that you're making? Is this a tool that you would like your project managers to use? And the response has always been yes. Okay. Monir, my clock says 1 o'clock. I don't have any other commitments. I can go, but
I gotta run to another meeting. Good catching up with all of you.
Yeah, thanks.
Good to see you,
Forward to
Mark.
my session in a few weeks.
All right, Robert or Fadi, do you have any other questions? Your mics are
Hi,
off.
everybody. Hi. I'm fine. Everything was clear. Thank you for your time. I had a chance to write an article on collaborative advantage, where the major stakeholders need to sit and agree on a set of objectives, and these objectives can be classified on different set of goals: core goals, shared goals, public value core, and so on and so forth. So this is an article I published a year ago that talks about a process of how to unify a set of objectives to the major stakeholders so that they can agree on how to move forward. Yep. I hope you can read it and send me your thoughts around it. Thank you.
I will take a look. Thank you. Robert, any questions from you? Okay, then Nada, I'll turn it back to you to close the meeting.
Great. Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you everybody for attending today. I hope that this webinar was informative and for your benefit. And we are really looking forward for future webinar as the same. Just want to let know everybody that we recorded the sessions and we will post it soon. So we will send you the link and it will be shared on our social media and Uruk LinkedIn page and other social media we will be sharing. And also I would like to remind our attendees and and everybody, if from your contact or your network, that we will have Uruk Orientation Solution webinars coming up soon on the 26th of April. And that will be an open discussion with the founder and the maker of Uruk platform, Mr. Munir. So where we were going to talk more about the platform features and benefits, and and it's open discussion for any areas where anybody would be interested to talk with Munir about. So we hope we will see you, and we hope also you can spread the word and invite your friends and colleagues to these webinars. So thank you everybody for coming, and we're looking forward for future more webinars, education orientations coming in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Nada. Bill, grateful for your time. Enjoyable as always. Take care, everybody.